For more reaction to President Xi's speech, I sat down earlier with the former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. Mr. Rudd, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
This was President Xi's first address to the United Nations General Assembly, covered a wide range of issues. What was the impact you think it had on delegates?
I think it was quite a remarkable speech. I've seen a lot of Chinese speeches to the General Assembly over the years. This one broke new ground. It broke new ground because it talked about one key thing, which is China's determination, irrespective of how powerful it becomes in the future, to continue to work within the rules of the existing international system. There's been a lot of debate about this in the international community, and I think such a definitive statement from the Chinese president before the nations of the world in the United Nations General Assembly is pretty significant. Of course, there are other specific dimensions of the speech which go to new areas as well, but I think in the fundamental underpinning of the UN rules-based system, this was a pretty significant speech.
Right, many have been questioning the effectiveness of the UN, so how important was this that China underlined that so clearly?
Well, as someone who studied the UN a long time myself, there is, I believe, a great importance for P5 members in particular to come in and to affirm not just the principles of the Charter, but the principles of the organisation and the rules under which it operates. China being a significant P5 member, very important, and Xi Jinping has just begun his political term. He's going to be president of China for quite some time to come. I think this sort of statement is important for the future functioning of the United Nations system. Apart from his statement, also, the allocation of Chinese troops for future UN peacekeeping purposes, significant. The allocation of funding to support future African contributions to UN peacekeeping operations, that's important. But also the decision to establish a particular development fund for South-South cooperation within the framework of the United Nations. That is also significant. These are new areas, and I think those who take the multilateral system seriously will be pretty pleased by that.
We also heard one other idea from him, and that was that developing countries need to have a bigger voice in international governance, in organizations like the United Nations. How do you think that will be heard in developed countries, in the P5 countries, for instance?
Well, when we debate the future voices of emerging countries from the developing world in the UN system, it usually focuses on, number one, the UN Security Council, focuses also on what happens with the Bretton Woods institutions, in particular the International Monetary Fund. And frankly, the whole machinery of global governance has to increasingly adjust to the rise of new powers and new voices. The system has been slow to do that. If you want the first example of adjustments being made, it's been in the G20. The G20 was created in emergency circumstances, a global financial crisis in 2008. And suddenly we realized that we needed a whole bunch of other voices around the table in order to make the solution work. I think that's been a warning call to the UN system to go beyond the arrangements we set in 1945. And we need to look seriously at UN Security Council reform to give greater voices to the developing world. But on top of that, in the international financial and economic institutions, the same logic applies. Personally, I find it absurd that here we are in 2015 and China's shareholding and therefore quota within the International Monetary Fund is about the same size as Belgium and the Netherlands put together. No disrespect to Belgium, no disrespect to the Netherlands, but frankly, that doesn't reflect international financial realities.
Let's get to some of the specifics in his speech. One of the main themes of his speech was efforts to combat climate change. This was not unexpected. We've heard this before. He said that China will shoulder its responsibility. What was the message he was sending to the world, especially to developed countries?
That everyone needs to lift their game, including the developed countries of the world. This is the thing I'm personally delighted about most in terms of the Xi Jinping statement. The reason being, I'm a long-standing advocate of global action on climate change. I was also a participant in the Copenhagen conference 5 years ago as head of government. And I saw what went wrong in Copenhagen. And one of the things that didn't work out in Copenhagen was having a strong and effective voice from India and from China on future action on climate change. Well, I'm pleased to say in the last few years that's changed. If you've got China now speaking with a clear voice about the need for domestic action within China on climate change, secondly, the announcement of specific measures, including a carbon target, including its own commitment now for a cap-and-trade system to be implemented beginning in 2017, this makes a material difference to the global dynamic. I mean, China is the largest greenhouse gas emitter. That's true. Cumulatively, the West, the developed world, bears huge responsibility. So China, it is good to see taking action, but I think it's a call to arms to the rest of us to lift our game. Every developed country in the world, including my own Australia.
He stressed equality and cooperation. Bigger nations, he said, should not bully smaller nations. He said that this is not the law of the jungle where weak nations can be at the mercy of stronger nations. We heard the words dialogue and cooperation several times in that speech.
Well, as we know, if we're students of Chinese foreign policy history, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence have been around for a long, long time. And they stress the sovereign equality of states. And that's also reflected in, of course, the principles of the United Nations Charter. Remember what we came from with the evolution of the UN Charter back in 1945. And that was a system where aggression against other states was a norm. And we came together in 45 and said, no, it's not a norm. It should never be a norm. And in fact, peaceful coexistence and the mutual respect of sovereign states shall be the norm. That's what we agreed to as an international community. So having President of the most populous country on the planet reaffirm that principle, I think is useful for the international community. There is much by way of cooperative effort we still need to do in the world. And when I see President Xi talking about the need for this new type of international relations, or more broadly what he describes as now a community of common international destiny, based on these principles of mutual respect and based on the principles of large states and small states coexisting, I think we're starting to head in the right direction.
With increasing warfare in the world, we see sectarian strife, extremism, things like climate change. These are major challenges for the whole world. Does it mean that countries like China and the United States need each other more now?
Well, I believe that the things that unite China and the United States in terms of their common concerns in the rest of the world far exceed those things which actually divide them bilaterally or in other parts of the world. If you put together the list of the common challenges in the rest of the world, they are formidable. It's not just the climate change question which affects the planet and therefore all of us, but on top of that, it's the security order. If we start to have non-state actors running around the place, as terrorists do, and launching attacks in Beijing or in Kunming or in other centres in the world, this has to be confronted with the full force of our common security forces, our common action. Now, that is a common interest as well of the United States and China, just like climate change. Similarly, the United States and China have common interests in avoiding nuclear proliferation. And that's why their agreement, together with others, in the Iranian nuclear arrangement is so important, and prospectively their cooperative work on the North Korean nuclear weapons program. So my argument, again, is pretty simple. And if you look at this objectively, put all the headlines to one side and just go through, here's the list of what these two big countries actually face in the rest of the world. That list, those areas of common policy concern, actually represents a bigger and more substantial list than the areas of traditional disagreement. And so I can't ignore these areas of traditional disagreement, but frankly we need to be working on both fronts at the same time.